Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our Bible study tonight, or I guess in this case, not exactly a Bible study, but our ongoing discussion about whether it makes sense, logically and in light of evidence, science, etc., to believe in a Creator. We're starting part 10 tonight of our series. If you're watching this live, it's August the 23rd of 2020, and I am very grateful for your presence and your interest, the time that you're investing in this. It sure makes it worth my time, knowing that it's worth your time. I can't think of anything more important for us to be looking at. As you know, we will continue with the questions that we're looking at that every human needs to consider, regardless of what you would like the answer to be or what you've always thought it was. We all need to know whether there is some kind of a superior entity, a God, a creator, or not. And what we want to look at is not just what would I like to believe or what do I not want to believe, but what does it really make sense to believe? And that's been our quest. And to do that, we have broken this down from the beginning of this series 10 weeks ago or 9 weeks ago into 4 major questions. This is, to me, a logical way to look at it. 4 things that really demand an explanation, either with the action of a superior entity who designed and created or without one. So we've looked at first the existence of all the matter and energy in the universe. Number 2, the precise structure and organization of the universe, quite incredible. Number 3, the initial appearance and survival of life on Earth. And now, the diversity and complexity and precision and function of life that we see all around us. And that 4th question is the one that we started started in on last week, and we will continue on tonight. So for the fourth question, we've said there are really a handful of competing hypotheses to be considered. One is that God created life as it exists today. A second is something called theistic evolution, which we'll come back and consider a bit later, which is the idea that there is a creator who put initial life on the planet, but then did not guide that life into what we see today, but more or less let it go, let evolution take place based upon the initial simple life that he did create. So that's an alternate theory involving a superior entity, but also including evolution. On the hypotheses that do not include the action of a superior entity with intelligent design, the primary atheistic theory is evolution, which we might call macroevolution or neo-Darwinism, the current version of Darwin's original theory, by natural selection from a number of random genetic mutations. That's the current iteration of that theory. An alternate to that, which we have mentioned and we will get into a bit later, is called punctuated equilibrium, with no mechanism actually proposed for it. So last week we looked at this again just to remind ourselves the creation or superior entity or intelligent design hypothesis is that there is a supernatural and eternally existing entity who created all that physically exists, both the universe and the life on this planet, etc., and that this entity created the laws of nature and physics and therefore alone has the power to override them if desired. The current evolution theory, neo-Darwinism or macroevolution, is this, that once primitive life existed by some process, as we talked about a few weeks ago, it then underwent a long and never-ending series of genetic mutations, some of which proved beneficial and thus were preserved and propagated by natural selection because of the survival advantages they conferred on that organism. And these eventually then gave rise to greater and greater changes, more and more complexity, the addition of more genetic material, and the appearance of new species, finally including humans. So that's that one. Punctuated equilibrium, as we mentioned, something put forth by Dr. Stephen Jay Gould and Niles Eldredge, is a variant within current evolutionary belief. It is a version of evolution, but with a very different set of facts and evidence underlying it. So we will very specifically address that. Okay, and as I said last week, I respectfully suggest everyone needs to give serious, respectful, and critical thought to the evolutionary theory. We need to understand the theory. You can't criticize something you don't know about and don't understand or haven't taken the time to know about. So if you really want to give it a fair evaluation, then we need to do just that, and that starts with understanding what it is. And it does need to be evaluated critically, not just given a pass and accepted as true. So either one of those is a problem. So that's what we're trying to do, look at whether it meets logical criteria for being believable or not. And then we need to understand whether you think evolution does make sense or you decide that it doesn't. We need to understand why so many people hold the opposite view from whichever one you come up with. Be able to make an intelligent and a cogent argument which supports your conclusion. Hopefully your conclusion is based on evidence, logic, good sense, and therefore an intelligent, cogent argument would be no problem. And there needs to be respect and civility all the way around, which is too often lacking in this particular conversation. So last week then, we started our consideration of evolution, and here's what I said I would like to organize it in this way. First of all, the unique premises and treatment of the theory, because it tends to get treated like nothing else in science or science-related matters. Second, the foundational assumptions, which is what we'll really get into tonight. Third, a critical analysis of the evidence for and against it in 5 parts, but again, do not fear, that does not mean 5 weeks, just 5 kind of outline areas. And then finally, some concluding analysis and consideration of theistic evolution. So last week we went through this, and I'm just going to read these so quickly tonight, that this theory gets treated like nothing else. Number one, the evolutionary hypothesis, originally by Darwin, was formulated and proposed and initially promoted without any evidence to suggest it, which is not the way you normally think of doing things in science, but that's the way this one was. Now I'm going to give him a pass on that because he did put the hypothesis forth, and it does need to be considered whether or not it came about by the usual methods of inference. But it was also put forward in opposition to an overwhelmingly apparent alternative, that of design and creation, which everyone agrees is what it looks like, whether you believe that's what the reality is or not. But even every atheist will agree everything looks like it's been designed. And so therefore that certainly would be one of your primary inferences in addition to the other hypotheses that you might consider. And again, they should always all be considered. So we're supposed to assume that extraordinarily ordered information, and we see that in life like nothing else, we're supposed to believe that that implies a series of random events and not intelligent design. So it's put forth really in the most counterintuitive way. We're supposed to reject what seems apparent and instead believe what seems virtually impossible. So that's a little bit different from the way we usually do science, you might say. All right, I showed you some things, and just grab anything you like. Any of these things, how many of the items on the screen would you reasonably think came into being without any design or intelligent intervention? Well, the answer, of course, is none of them. You know better. And I could tell you what the criteria for detecting design are, but I think you kind of know that. So we talked about the idea that even the people at SETI, they recognize that if they get coordinated information, that strongly suggests, very, very strongly suggests that it came by design from an intelligent source by deliberate action. So why do we assume just the opposite in accepting evolution? All right, another way that it gets treated like nothing else in history, it was initially put forth without any actual proposed mechanism at all. Darwin just said there were a series of gradual changes. Now, I'm giving him a pass on that, and actually, I think his original theory, even though I don't find it believable when I've looked at everything, but I sure do find it to be the product of intelligent thought and fairly clever. Okay, so I just don't have a problem with looking at the evolutionary theory and giving it a very fair shake. And we have to. I have to. Because I did not arrive at my conclusions without very thorough scrutiny. But even 160 years later, there's still no precise mechanism. You can say, well, yeah, random genetic mutations. Yeah, but we never hear what they are. It's just that whichever ones needed to happen, they happened. There's no proposed sequence, etc. It's still just maddeningly vague after 160 years of time to fill in the blanks. Nobody's really even tried to fill in the blanks. All right. A third way is that it's different from anything else. It was initially completely unfalsifiable when Darwin put it forth. So if there's absolutely no potential way to disprove something, to potentially falsify it, we usually reject those things, or at least look at them with a wary eye. Now, we should look at everything with a healthy skepticism, but initially it was completely unfalsifiable, which should have made it essentially ineligible for serious consideration. Now, it is falsifiable at this point. We're going to get into that. So it certainly does deserve our serious, respectful scrutiny and evaluation. Okay, a fourth way that it's like nothing else in history is that, in general, adherents of evolution seek to disqualify any consideration of the competing hypothesis, that of intelligent design by a superior entity. It is, to me, quite astounding how vitriolic some atheistic evolutionists can be in telling you that no, the alternative of a superior entity cannot be considered, not even considered. We looked at some of that at the very beginning of our series of discussions. And this disqualification of any other hypothesis not only is eagerly sought, but it is largely enforced. And we'll look at some things about that in the next couple of weeks here. Instead of embracing an honest and thorough analysis and comparison, which ought to be the way we approach anything, let the evidence stack up. Let's look at it and see, let it speak for itself, not put a gag on one hypothesis and then accept the other. All right, a fifth way that it's different is it is avidly shielded usually from any real critical analysis and any real falsification effort. It's kind of given a pass. It's considered exempt from any of that. In fact, a lot of textbooks say, oh, it's a fact. We don't need to debate it anymore. The debate's over. No, the debate never took place is what really what it amounts to. But you and I are having it. We're going to take a look at it. All right, and number 6, where we ended last week, was that the hypothesis, evolutionary hypothesis, is still based entirely on a series of assumptions. And that's what occurred to me a couple of years ago as I'm studying this, and had been for quite some time, and got back into it so heavily. I realized that we're not usually asked to accept it based on the evidence. We're going to look at the evidence, but it's usually just on a series of assumptions. And they're unproven. And some of them are quite uncertain, and that would be an understatement. And that's where we're going to pick up tonight. Now, there's a 7th way that it's unlike anything else in science or science-related material, and I'll save that one for a little bit later. All right, so moving then to our second place where we're really going to dig into tonight. So what are the foundational assumptions underlying the evolutionary theory? And I've heard all of these before, but I've never really seen anybody put it together quite this way. Maybe that's because they're a lot smarter than I am. I wouldn't doubt that. But this is the way that, as I have spent so long looking at this and considering it, this is the way that it made sense to me to organize it. Because there really are a series of foundational assumptions that usually is what we're told about evolution, and you're not supposed to question them. Well, as with everything, we're going to question them. So here we go, looking at the foundational assumptions underlying evolutionary theory. Now, I'm just going to whiz through them real quick, and then we'll come back, explain what each one is, and then take them apart one by one to see if they really stand up to believability or not. Here they are, though. And you may not have seen them exactly like this, but I think you'll recognize as we go through them, it's like, oh yeah, okay, that's what I've always heard. I just never saw it put down in order altogether. But the first one is this: anything that can be conjectured is possible, no matter how unlikely it might be. If we can think it up, then anything is possible. That's assumption A. B is, okay, therefore, that anything we can conjecture is possible. Given enough time, anything that can be conjectured eventually will happen. It's inevitable if you give it enough time. It's not only possible, but it'll happen finally, no matter what the odds are against it. Assumption C. And given enough time, and maybe some parallel multiple universes to increase our chances here, we've talked about that, and it pops up yet again here for the 3rd time. Okay, but given enough time and maybe enough universes, it will eventually happen again and again, not just once. Okay, D kind of steps to the side for just a little bit. What is sometimes called microevolution, we'll come back to that, of course, confirms these assumptions and reliably implies the occurrence of macroevolution by extrapolation. That is, if we can see a fair amount of change happening in a pretty short period of time, well, that just proves A, B, and C, and it certainly tells us you give it a little more time, you'll get all kinds of change, okay? That's a basic, a very strong foundational assumption of evolution. So we're going to give that real attention. And E, therefore, that's what happened. No matter how improbable, no matter how counterintuitive, no matter how much that's opposed to the obvious inference of design by a superior entity, but no, this is what happened because A, B, C, and D are true. All right, let's then come back and look at those. And what I'm going to do is kind of run through them again, give a little bit more thought or structure to what they mean, and then delve into each one of them. Okay, A, anything that can be conjectured is possible. no matter how unlikely it may be. So anything I throw out there, and in this case, it's going to be that random genetic mutations can produce useful new features and functions. Now, we're going to have to curtail our discussion from detail so much. I would love to spend another 20 or 30 hours of discussion time. I think every one of you would tune out by then because you're not as interested in this as I am, I would imagine. But I would love for us to give it the time that it deserves to get down into the nitty-gritty details of gene structure, etc. That's where it really, really gets interesting, or maybe gets really boring depending on your view. All right, but you know something about genetic mutations. You have probably known of people who had a stillborn child, and your heart goes out to them, of course, or they have miscarried. And it's just tragic, the loss. But most of those are because there was a random genetic mutation in the baby that was incompatible with life. Most genetic mutations are either fatal or they cause serious harm. Yeah, I'm sure you've probably known some people too with genetically based physical problems or cognitive problems, things that seriously impaired them, the quality of their life because of a genetic mutation, or maybe greatly shortened their life. Cystic fibrosis, we could just, sickle cell anemia, we could go down numerous lists. So you already know, I think, that by far most genetic mutations are either harmful, sometimes deadly, and sometimes they're neutral. Sometimes there is a certain amount of redundancy in our DNA that you can tolerate a certain number of mutations that are not in supercritical areas that, as far as we know, don't cause any harm. But what we're assuming for evolution, though, is that some of those mutations are really good. Not many, obviously, everybody knows that, but every now and then there's going to be a genetic mutation, or it would take a whole cluster of sequential mutations that can not only not be harmful, but produce a useful new anatomic feature, maybe result in lungs in an animal that didn't have lungs, or it can grow a hand, not all at once, but one feature at a time, etc., that eventually it can give rise to new anatomic features that are helpful, or to new physiologic functions. Maybe there's a series of mutations that allow you to have hemoglobin molecules to carry oxygen in your blood, or that allow you to breathe air when your ancestors came from the ocean, etc. So that's the idea. But it rests that anything that can be conjectured is possible. And certainly we can conjecture of something like that happening, no matter how wildly unlikely or improbable it is, and I can assure you it is. Nobody disagrees on that either. But that's the idea with assumption A. All right, the idea with the next one is, therefore, given enough time, anything that can be conjectured not only can happen, but it will happen if you wait long enough, so that useful new features and functions will occur. A fish will develop lungs, and etc. Color, high-definition vision will develop. And so when those things occur, they will give enough survival advantage to the one organism that they first appear in, that then they will eventually then predominate and spread throughout all of the population until they become the new norm, and then the next one. So the idea is, given enough time, those things will happen, and those new anatomic features and physiologic functions will occur, and they will be preserved for future generations. Okay, C is this one. Given enough time, then okay, we might have needed a really long time for that to happen, but if you give enough time, and again they throw in and maybe parallel universes, because that always really helps, then it will happen again and again and again and again, okay? There will be an unending procession of these beneficial mutations which will build new features, new functions. They will just build advantage upon advantage, and finally yield major changes and even whole new species of organisms. And the other part of this assumption is not only that will occur if you give enough time, but that there has been enough time for this to occur. Okay, and again, the anthropic principle is often misused here and misapplied to say, well, yeah, it probably would take a really long time, but obviously there's been enough time because we're here. Okay, again, that kind of glosses over and assumes that this is how we got here. And as you well know, unless you just really like circular reasoning, you don't assume the question to be true while you're trying to figure out whether the question is true. All right. But that's the idea of assumption C. D then is this. Microevolution, as some people call it, and I don't really prefer the term because it's, as you're going to see, a completely different phenomenon from evolution. But you can call it microevolution if you want. That is adaptation of species to their environment, the predominance of organisms that are best suited to their environment, natural selection, okay, which that is a given. We can measure it, watch it, etc. There's no doubt natural selection occurs. And some people call that microevolution. And there are other things too that we're going to see. You see animals, well, especially animals, but any organism really showing remarkable adaptation to their environment. So the idea then is, well, if we can see these things happen, we can see, measurable, definitely discernible changes within sometimes even less than 30 years, 20 years, sometimes within 10 years or even a generation of animals. If we can see that, then that just really confirms that those first three must be true, and it reliably implies that macroevolution will occur if you just give it a little more time. So if you can see changes of some significance in a short period of time, then by extrapolation you can say, well, then the whole theory is obviously true. That's the fourth assumption, the way I've organized it. And finally, the fifth one, assumption E, therefore, that's what happened. No matter how improbable, and everyone agrees it is just unbelievably improbable, no matter how counterintuitive, anybody would agree on that too. Okay, so, but no matter how unlikely it is, well, that's what happened, and it must be true because we're here and there's no other explanation, especially if you refuse to consider any other explanation. So that's kind of the assumptions of evolution, kind of in an overview fashion. But are they true? So, see, not only are these widely held assumptions, but the first three in particular seem to be held as just self-evident and beyond question. You don't even question that, the first three. And then anyone who dares to question the last two is frequently dismissed as uninformed or worse. There's some pretty nasty things that are said. Now, most evolutionists that I know are perfectly nice people and respectful, and they don't have a problem with what you might believe, and they don't think you're stupid for believing something different from what they are. And so, look, most people, and on the other side too, most people who do believe in a superior entity are not nasty about it, and they don't criticize people who don't, etc. But sometimes it happens, and it's just shocking to me. And there's a kind of a handful of famous characters on the evolution and atheistic side who say quite horrible things about anybody who would question any of these things. And it's really bad a lot of times, too, when it turns out that they're wrong. Well, you'll never hear them admit that, though, because the handful of people who show such disdain and disrespect for anybody who disagrees with them, well, they're never wrong about anything anyway. And I know that's not who we're talking to here. I think if you're tuned into this, no matter what side of this debate of ideas you fall on, I think we're all looking for the truth here, or we wouldn't be spending our time on this. And hopefully, as I said before, with a very genuine respect for anybody else that may be at a different place in this analysis. All right, but if we want to have our best chance of finding the truth, we'd better question every one of these assumptions. If you believe in evolution, don't you want to know that those are actually true, that they make sense? Okay, if you do not believe in evolution after everything we look at, don't you want to know why? I mean, really, why? That you don't believe it makes sense? So nothing gets a pass as far as I'm concerned. Everything gets questioned. Even the things that I hold dear, I better be willing to question them. Well, this is pretty huge here. So if we want to find the truth, we'd better question all of these assumptions. Hey, and if they're true, then they should come through with flying colors. All right, well, let's look at them then. So that first one again, anything that can be conjectured is possible, no matter how unlikely it might be. And in this case, what we're talking about is that random genetic mutations, enough of them can occur and be preserved so that they finally produce a useful new anatomic feature or physiologic function. What do you think about that? The idea that anything I can conjecture is possible. Well, that may seem self-evident at first glance, because you might say, well, yeah, anything's possible. We're not saying it's likely, that's another question. But, well, yeah, sure, anything's possible. However, think about it for a minute. Instead of being self-evident, this statement, this assumption, is actually, for the most part, an unfalsifiable assertion. Certainly not something to be assumed as true. It's unfalsifiable. And you know what we've said about that? If something is unfalsifiable, that is, there's no way to potentially disprove it or find it false, or if you cannot find it false, then it stands a good chance of being true. This one, you can't really test it, for the most part. However, to the extent that it can be tested, it's actually not consistent with experimental observations. So anything that's completely unfalsifiable, no way to potentially disprove it, we ought to be extremely wary about from the word go. But this one, to the extent that we can test it, and you cannot test it, when you make a statement that anything is possible, well, there's actually no way to test that, okay? Because if it doesn't ever happen, you can just say, well, if you gave it another 1,000,000 years, it would. Okay, well, it becomes kind of a magic assumption. So it's largely unfalsifiable, but to the extent that it can be, it comes up short. Let me show you what I mean. On the screen there, you see 3 pictures. One is my hand, the middle one is a brick, and on the right-hand side is a diagram of what we believe the structure of an atom to be. I'm sure you recognized it. So in that atom, in the middle are protons and neutrons, and people wonder there may be some other things too, but that's what we know about. And then orbiting the nucleus of the atom are a number of electrons, and they're in different orbits at different energies, etc. It's looks a lot, it's kind of uncanny, it looks a lot like our solar system with planets orbiting the sun. All right, but in that atom, the huge majority of that atom, the huge majority of the volume, you might say, of an atom is actually empty space. In fact, almost all of it is empty space because the electrons are very, very tiny and they're out there orbiting around the nucleus, etc. So therefore, think about this. I conjecture and I tell you that if I take my hand and this brick, both of which are made up of molecules of different substances, which are made up of atoms of different elements, etc. But when it comes down to it, both my hand and this brick are made up of millions and millions and billions and trillions of atoms. So, if we could see it, even though my hand looks solid, most of it is actually empty space. The brick looks fairly solid. It's a little bit porous, but most of it, in reality, it's empty space. So therefore, theoretically, I can take my hand and pass it through the brick. The brick in my hand, theoretically, could pass through each other because it's mainly empty space, and if I happen to do just right, well, you can see they can just slide right through each other without anything ever actually hitting. What do you think? See, theoretically, that's possible. But is it possible? Well, here's the thing. Every time I test it, it keeps not working. And, now I do have a tiny bit of sense in my head, so I didn't do it too many times, because after a while your hand gets sore. But because to me, I haven't had the brick and my hand pass through each other yet. And of course, the worst thing would be is if it got halfway through and then they were melded together somehow. I think that might be a problem. But you don't have to worry about that, because your hand, it's not going in the brick. It's just not, okay? And I can do this if I've got poor sense. I can keep doing this to wait until it would happen. But I could do it, and I think you know this, I could do it for the next 1,000,000 years. My hand's not going through the brick. And if you want to do this for the rest of your lifetime, how long do you think it's going to take before your hand goes through the brick? Theoretically, it's supposed to be possible. The problem is, it's not actually possible. And you can say, well, if you give it long enough, it would. How many billions of years do you think until the hand goes through the brick? It doesn't happen. So when you say that anything that can be conjectured is possible, well, yeah, that's true on paper, but it doesn't seem to be true in reality. Now, you can still believe it if you want, okay? It might be true. It's just there's no way to know that, but at least to the extent that we can test it, it doesn't seem to be true. So, as I say at the bottom of this slide, the verdict, it's largely unfalsifiable and therefore highly suspect, but to the extent that it can be tested, it is effectively falsified. That is, it's not true. And it certainly then cannot be a valid assumption. Many unlikely things obviously are possible. There are people who win the lottery. It's highly unlikely that one person is going to do it, but it happens. But a universal assumption that anything I can conjecture can happen, it might be true, but it cannot be considered a valid assumption. I hope that makes sense to you. I don't know if you've ever thought about that, and you might think, oh, look, come on, why are we wasting our time talking about this? Because that's what evolution rests on. That's the very first assumption upon which it rests, and you're supposed to accept it as being true. Evidently, it's not true, or has a high likelihood of not being actually true. That's what I should say. All right, what about the second one? Well, therefore, if anything I can conjecture is possible, therefore, given enough time, and it might take a long time, but given enough time, anything that can be conjectured will happen. That is, eventually my hand will go right through the brick without ever touching anything. And useful new anatomic features and new physiologic functions will occur in evolving organisms, and they will be preserved. What do you think? So you're supposed to believe that this also is inevitably true. You're supposed to scratch your head and say, well, I mean, yeah, I guess anything can happen. And, well, then, yeah, I guess, theoretically, if you had enough time, I guess anything would eventually happen. You're supposed to believe it's inevitably true, even if it's uncomfortable and counterintuitive, and it is, but you're supposed to believe it because you assume the truthfulness of that first assumption, which, as we saw, maybe that wouldn't be such a good assumption to make. So you're supposed to believe this one too. Well, what's the verdict? This one is completely unfalsifiable. There's no way you can potentially disprove that given enough time, anything that can be conjectured will happen. Now, it may not be likely to be true, but you never can actually completely falsify it. But I will say this, so it's completely unfalsifiable, and therefore it has to go on the extremely suspicious list, if not outright rejection. Furthermore, it cannot be true unless assumption A is definitely true, and even then, it's not a given and quite doubtful. So this is not a valid assumption, okay? Now, the fact that I can say something like I did a minute ago, my hand in the brick, or I can write it on a piece of paper, and I can show you on a piece of paper how my hand is going to pass right through the brick, I can show you that. Or I can write a computer simulation, because computer simulations do what we program into them. I can do a computer simulation, and I can show you how my hand's going to go through the brick. Doesn't make it so. All right? And it sure doesn't make it something that you can assume to be true. Quite the opposite, I think, if anything. Now, there are unlikely things that will happen. And the more time you take, yes, it becomes slightly more likely that certain things will happen, although a number of them in reality still will probably never happen. Sorry to burst the bubble, but you sure can't assume that they're going to. You can consider it, no problem with that, but you sure can't assume it's going to happen. And you can't base an entire theory and worldview on faulty assumptions. Here's the third one. And so, given enough time, and maybe, as many million other universes as it takes to bolster the odds up, but given enough time, it will happen again and again. There will be an unending procession of these beneficial mutations, each, giving rise to useful new features and functions, etc., and they will build advantage upon advantage for certain organisms, which will eventually yield major changes and even new species and new organisms. And the other half of the assumption, and that there has been enough time for this to occur. Well, what do you think about that one? The verdict, again, completely unfalsifiable. And the usual justification for it is, well, it's obviously true because we're here. Okay, again, you know what I think about completely misapplying the anthropic principle and circular reasoning, assuming what you're trying to prove or disprove. It's completely unfalsifiable. You tell me how you could potentially disprove that. Now, common sense may argue against it, but in a real sense, there's no way to potentially falsify that. But keep this in mind, it cannot be true unless assumption A and assumption B are both definitely true. And even then, it's very unlikely to be true, no matter how much time you could allot for it. It's not a valid assumption. Again, the fact that I can say something or write it on a piece of paper or write a computer simulation doesn't necessarily make it so. Well, you might very well say, well, let's talk about that. How can I say that's unlikely to be true, even if both A and B could somehow be true? How can I say that? Well, let's analyze it a little bit in light of reality. And by the way, lest you think I'm making this up, this is exactly what an acceptance of evolutionary theory is based on. All right, so let's talk about that. How can I say it's very unlikely that this is true, even if A and B assumptions could be true? Well, because just like the idea of abiogenesis that we talked about, it depends on things that are extremely unlikely to happen, and despite all of our just most studious, most intelligent experimental effort, we don't see them happen. They're not known to happen. But instead, they're happening again and again and again and again. No matter how unlikely they are to have ever occurred, well, we're just saying, man, you just can't stop them. They're happening so frequently. And both mathematics and common sense argue against this. Now, it's very tempting to get into probabilities and the odds of something happening by chance. And boy, it'll open your eyes, that's for sure. You get numbers that are just absolutely, well, technically not impossible, but about as close to impossible as you can get, okay? And I could show you those numbers, but if we do that, we have to make certain assumptions, and you don't know if they're right or not. So I could give you a set of numbers, and then one of my friends could say, oh, no, those numbers are not right, because if you had this many organisms in an ocean evolving, then then those odds would be drastically better, etc. So I'm not even going to put numbers on the board because they all involve things that we just can't know. But here's what we all know. And again, nobody would argue against this. These things are extremely unlikely. But based on the assumptions that we've said, supposedly, they not just happen once or twice, they happen again and again and again and again. Okay? When you take something that is extremely unlikely to happen, and then you multiply that by the extremely unlikely chances of it happening a second time, And then you multiply that by the extremely unlikely chances of a third time and a fourth time and a fifth time. And once you get to the several billion times that you would need to have something like a human or even the simplest organism you can think of, well, common sense kind of says, I'm not so sure that happened, okay? Or at least I'm not going to assume it. That's all I'm going to tell you. I'm not going to tell you it could not have happened. It's virtually impossible. It's as close to impossible as you can get, okay? But nevertheless, I think we should entertain the idea. Let's say we can't assume that it happened, but I'm telling you that we ought to at least consider that it might have happened, all right? Hey, I think that's pretty fair. So I'm very willing to consider that it might have happened. I'm just not willing to have somebody tell me that it obviously did. No, it's not obvious at all. All right. So it's fine to entertain the idea, but in no rational construction of thought can it be assumed as true. And I will say this again, and you may say, oh, nobody says there are multiple universes. Oh, yes. Do some reading. You won't believe it. And once again, when there's the invoking of multiple universes in order to try to make something have some kind of odds of actually happening, it ought to be a huge red flag that something doesn't make enough sense to stand on its own. If I have to posit millions of other universes so that hopefully I can get it to happen in one of them, something's wrong, all right? Now, again, I'm not going to tell you it couldn't have happened. We're going to look at that. I'm just going to tell you there's no way you can assume that it happened and tell somebody else that they need to believe it too. So the verdict, completely unfalsifiable, cannot be true unless the first two assumptions are definitely true, and even then, very unlikely to be true, no matter how much time you give it. 5 billion years, 13 billion years, 25 trillion years, it doesn't matter. You give it as much time as you want, you increase the chances by about that much. And that's just the truth, okay? All right, so that's the third assumption. Here's the fourth one. That microevolution, so-called, that is small changes within an animal line, a species, etc., adaptation, confirms that these assumptions clearly must be true, and it reliably implies that you can extrapolate those little changes to, say, macroevolution, the whole evolutionary theory is also true. You see, if we can see significant changes occurring in a short period of time, well, then this must prove that the whole theory has to be true, and we can extrapolate that, so you're going to see huge changes and whole new species and the random assembly of a human being even, given enough time. All right? So small adaptive changes, which are being accomplished fairly rapidly, this has long been considered the confirmation of these assumptions. I mean, this is the one that evolutionists sometimes just mercilessly make fun of the stupidity of anybody who doesn't see this and accept it as true. This is supposed to be a glimpse of evolution in action. So if we can see evolution happening within our own lifetimes, right in front of our eyes, then what kind of a moron would not be able to see that big changes happen over millions of years and maybe even a few billion years? It can be reliably extrapolated, like a train on a track. Okay, there's one well-known evolutionist, not known for being a nice person, but at any rate, I'm not going to put a name with it. I'd be happy to do it because he certainly signs his name to what he says about people and ideas. But one of his favorite things is to give the analogy that if he puts his mom on a train in Chicago and it's headed toward Miami, and they stand and wave till it gets a quarter mile down the track and it's headed, south and slightly east, I guess, etc. Well, it doesn't take a genius to figure out that if the train just keeps on going in that direction, it will get to Miami. He said, so what's so difficult about that? Even a creation believer ought to be able to understand that. Except we now know that's not the way it works. You see, this idea initially, it seemed intuitively like it could be true, but it wasn't actually falsifiable initially. But now it is. See, people are doing really good research. I mean all kinds of people. And I love to read the research, including of atheists and evolutionists. It's great. A lot of very intelligent people, and a lot of them, sometimes you have to kind of bite your lip at the conclusions of their papers, but look at their data. It's really good, okay? So in 2017, somebody finally said, well, let's figure out exactly which genes are mutating here in these. We're going to come back and show you this for sure. It had to do with Darwin's original examples, the finches on the Galapagos Islands. Well, we'll get into the details later, but for now, let me just say, initially, this was an unfalsifiable assumption, but now, based on some really great research, it is potentially falsifiable. Because with the latest research findings from 2017, it's pretty recent, we now know that the mechanism for these smaller rapid changes is completely different from the mechanism proposed for neo-Darwinian evolution, the macroevolution. They're completely separate phenomena. They're not connected. Well, they're marginally, distantly connected, but not the same thing at all. No reason to any longer think that one has anything to do with the other. I think that may be pretty interesting to you. It's quite eye-opening when you look at it and realize the implications of it, because that's what the whole evolutionary theory was pinned on. All right, so assumption D, that small changes, adaptation confirms the first three assumptions and tells you that macroevolution will take place. The verdict, there's no actual connection between the two. We now know that. It has moved from being unfalsifiable into the column of very effectively falsified. It's not true, and it's sure not a valid assumption. All right? The last one then, the last foundational assumption of evolution is that, well, based on those first four, that's what happened. No matter how improbable it is, and everybody agrees on that, no matter how counterintuitive it is, and most people would agree on that, it certainly looks like design. We'll see some quotes about that too. But it must be true because the first four are true assumptions, and we're here, and there's no other explanation for that, so it must all be true. Well, that's quite a set of assumptions, isn't it? But as in every misuse of the anthropic principle, that's a huge assumption. It ought to have rock-solid, incontrovertible evidence to support it. May I offer you an analogy of that last assumption and the package of all five together? I say on the slide here, it begins with the sound of breaking glass. So here it is. Let's say I'm working in my yard. I hear the sound of shattering glass coming from the direction of my driveway. I run over there, and you're standing there next to my car. You have a sledgehammer in one hand. There's a big hole in my car window. And in your other hand, you're holding my original vinyl edition of the Frampton Comes Alive double album that was on the front seat of my car, and I know you've been wanting it because we've discussed it several times lately. And I look at you, and I say, you want to explain exactly why you did this? And you look at me and you say, did what? I didn't do anything. And then you say, okay, I know what you think, but no, what happened was I was just standing here next to your car with a sledgehammer, minding my own business. By the way, I can tell you from years working in the emergency rooms, minding your own business, probably the world's most dangerous activity. That's what most people were doing when two big dudes came and attacked them for no reason. But at any rate, never mind. So you're saying I was just standing there with a sledgehammer, minding my own business, because I was carrying my sledgehammer over to your neighbor's house to loan it to him. And so I was just standing here, and here comes a meteorite. I mean, just like it whizzed right by my head, and just boom, right through your car window, and I couldn't believe it. And you know, in the shock wave from that, it blew your Frampton Comes Alive vinyl double album out through the hole in the glass, and it landed in my hand, and then here you come running over here. I'm not buying it. Are you? See, here's the problem with this, with your story. I've got a real good idea that didn't happen. It's just so improbable. Now, is it possible? Yeah, technically. There could have been a meteorite, and it made that hole in the window, and you really were just standing there with a sledgehammer minding your own business. Theoretically, it's all possible. I'm not buying it because I've got two eyes and some common sense. So, but you could say, well, yeah, it happened. You can't prove it didn't happen. But the thing kind of speaks for itself, though. I know what didn't happen. It's what you just described. And if you want to convince me it happened, man, I'm going to tell you, there really better be a smoking meteorite sitting there, either in the floorboard of my car or burrowed into the driveway below it. I better find a meteorite there that explains this thing, because I got a pretty good idea what didn't happen, and I got a pretty good idea what did happen. The problem with your story of the car break-in is the same problem with these assumptions. Even if A and B and C are true, and see, they're possible technically, that they could be true, we just don't know them to be true, and they're probably not. But even if they are true, it's still just not a credible story that all of this happened. All of these just hugely improbable events, unlikely events, they all happened again and again and again and again to produce this from nothing. So no matter what the alternatives are, I don't think that your story has credibility. That's the thing. Theoretical possibility does not equal credibility, doesn't even come close to equaling credibility or believability in a story. But I see a story there that I think did happen because everything points to it. So what's the verdict on this final assumption? Oh, it's quite the audacious claim that this could happen, so therefore it did. Initially, it was not falsifiable, but now it is, because now we have evidence. Mr. Darwin didn't have it in his day. Now we do. So this is certainly not a valid assumption, but let's consider it as a possibility. Instead of assuming it, well, let's dive into the evidence and see how it stacks up. Wouldn't that be the way to do it, now that we actually do have 160 years worth of some accumulated evidence? So the question's going to be, does this story have credibility? Does the evidence support it? Does it make more sense and have greater explanatory power than the competing hypotheses? Those are the questions as we actually let the evidence speak for itself about evolution. So the third thing then is, after the foundational assumptions, now we're going to go to a critical analysis of the evidence, for, against, neutral, etc. And we will also put in there the idea of the alternative atheistic theory of punctuated equilibrium. That's where we head next, is a critical analysis of the evidence. I hope you will join us. It's about to get really, really even more interesting. And I am grateful to you for spending your time to consider these ideas. I hope you have a great week ahead.
Thank you for joining us online. Please join us again for our next service. Worship services are in person and online Sunday mornings at 8:15 and 10 o'clock. Masks are required at the 8:15 service. Masks are strongly recommended at the 10 o'clock service. Bible study is online only Sunday evenings at 5 o'clock. Summer series is online only Wednesday evenings at 6:30. You can also watch our daily devotionals and other special presentations on Facebook at the Creve Hall COC Videos page. Again, thank you for joining us